Hi, and welcome to the Becoming Trauma-Informed podcast, where we help you understand how your past painful experiences are affecting your current reality and how you can shift those so you can create your desired future. I'm Dr. Lee, and both myself and our team at the Institute for Trauma and Psychological Safety are excited to support you on your journey. We talk about all the things on this podcast. No topic gets left uncovered. So, extending a content warning to you before we get started. If you notice yourself getting activated while listening, invitation to take care of yourself and to pause, skip ahead a bit, or just check out another episode. Let's dive in. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. Oh, today's just going to be really fun because we have an amazing guest and we met on TikTok. So Dr. Christy Gibson, the author of the Modern Trauma Toolkit, which is a book that she graciously sent to me, and I started reading on vacation and have had to hold myself back from reading because I'm supposed to be doing other things. And it's so good. And we connected on one of, I don't remember if it was one of your videos or one of my videos, and then started chatting in the DMs. And I was like, you have to come on the podcast. So Christine, I'd love to, if you'd share with our audience just a little bit more about you, like who you are and what lights you up in the world and why you do what you do.
Yeah. So it's funny, on TikTok, I'm actually Christy. So I was just kind of realizing that after you said my name, I'm like, oh yeah. So professionally for 20 years as a family doctor, I've been Christine because I thought it was like a more serious name. But before I was in medical school, I was Christy. So that was my name on Facebook because I don't friend patients on Facebook. I do have some boundaries around that. So I was like, I'll just be Christy on Facebook because that's where a lot of folks know me from. And then TikTok kind of pulled that name over. And I was like, that kind of is who I am. I'm actually a much more casual person. I don't introduce myself as Dr. Gibson to people, unless I'm trying to make a point. But no, I'm just not that person. I try really hard to be more curious and more humble and not try to say I know all the things. So yeah, the thing that lights me up right now is in academia, we call it knowledge translation and KT. And what it means is how do you share information in ways that people understand it, care about it, and it's going to be useful. And not just a one way, oh, I'm the expert, I'm going to tell you how things go, but where am I learning? So it's kind of cool that we both have the TikTok experience because that's something I'm super passionate about. This is where KT is happening. I'm learning so much on the app and I'm sharing a lot. And the book is kind of continuing that process. So I started on TikTok first before I had the book deal. Obviously, it contributed because I have a platform there that people are resonating with the way that I say things. And my goal with the book was to say, how can we have a conversation about trauma that's gentle? And I hadn't really seen that out there yet. So, you can tell from my bookshelf, for those of you watching this on video, I have a huge bookshelf. I've probably read somewhere between 300 and 500 books since I've started the journey around both being a trauma therapist and also learning more about systems change, because those are two really important things for me. And for me, so much of it was, how can we change systems together? I don't think I can change systems, but if I'm in conversations with people and if I'm putting stuff in the book that is not just what is trauma in the individual body, but what's happening in the communities and the ecosystems, and how can we work together to prevent and to shift? That's what I'm really passionate about right now, because I'm kind of scared with the way things are going with climate and politics and infectious agents. And there's just a lot of things that worry me. And I know that the solution is community.
I have had goosebumps from the second you started talking, just because, as somebody who's a non-mental health clinician talking about trauma, my expertise is in translation, right? Evidence-based practice. How do we take what we're seeing in the literature and what we're seeing in the academic and clinical spaces and also combine that with our lived experiences as clinicians or as the people who are teaching, and then also combine that with the experiences and the preferences and the pain of the humans that we're talking to, right? And that translation piece, it is a place that I think there's so much opportunity and so much growth. And I love the way that you talked about how do we come at this from gentleness. And that's the feeling. Whenever I watch your videos, I'm like, I hadn't put the word on it. That's what they are. They're very gentle. It's, hey, I'm going to talk to you about this thing. And also it's coming from this place of community and curiosity and gentleness and compassion. And I think that's what really resonated with me, because I was like, wow, she's talking about these really hard things in a way that feels inviting to people who've maybe never heard these really hard things talked about.
And now I've got goosebumps. Yeah, I mean, the more I learned about trauma, one of my favorite teachers is Dr. Eric Gentry out of the Arizona Trauma Institute.
Are you kidding
do you
me?
love him too?
Oh
I'm
my
obsessed with
gosh,
him.
he's my favorite. Oh,
He's
yes.
my
Okay, keep
favorite.
going.
And,
Yes.
and what I love about him is he's kind of nourishing and he's just really real and human, and he's in it. He's in it with us. Like,
Yeah.
it's not other people in pain. We're in pain too. And he acknowledges that and allows us to be like equally vulnerable and able to hold space. And so when I show up that I know I'm in a good place is when I can keep, like, I'm a proponent of polyvagal theory, and I know not everybody is, but I really think clinically it's so helpful. And so in polyvagal theory, we talk about what does it feel like when your nervous system is able to be calm and connected to another person. And so I really tried hard to write my book when I was in that place, to record TikToks when I'm in that place, because people can feel it energetically. I mean, I can't always show up in that way clinically, but I sure do try. And that is the healing process. Like, that's what Dr. Gentry says is, it doesn't actually matter what modality you use. What really matters is how attuned you are, like whether or not you're able to be in a safe nervous system yourself, whether or not you're able to be connected and listening, whether or not you actually care. And I don't necessarily know that the way people have been talking about trauma is translating that. And that to me is so fundamental. So that's been my goal in all the spaces where I'm interacting is, how can I show up in a way that's nourishing? How can I show up in a way that's creating an environment where safety is possible?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Dr. Eric Gentry was my second. So I had a toe dip into trauma and forward facing trauma practices. And then I was like, I need more, and went and learned. And Dr. Gentry was the human that taught me first. Something he said in the training I was in, it still sticks with me. He's like, what your clients need, they need positive expectancy, right? They need you to believe that they can feel better, no matter what modality we use, like that they can feel better. And we actually just did a 5-day training on an intro to trauma and recovery, and we named it ADAPT, and I named it that because of one of the things that Dr. Gentry says, which is, traumatized brains are highly adaptable brains. He said, when I have clients come into my space or patients come into my space, I say, I know that you can change because you already have. And it's such a empowering, it's a perspective shift of, if I could self-protect around all of the past painful experiences I had to the point that I'm sitting here today alive and in front of you, like, I can also change and start regulating my nervous system in a way and learning how to recover in a way that that things get to feel better and different.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you said that the book deal happened after you got on TikTok and these things were happening. Was that correct?
Yeah. And like relatively quickly,
Yeah.
if I'm getting the timelines right, I think it was within the first like 6 to 8 months, I was
Yeah.
getting kind of just unsolicited requests for, partnerships and the stuff you get. But one person had suggested writing a book. And I'm a writer. I've been writing poetry since I was a kid, like to process my own emotions. It's one of the
Yeah.
tools that I use. And I'd been working on a fiction novel. It's actually historical fiction and cli-fi, which is like eco fiction. So it's like there
Fascinating.
was some futuristic when climate chaos is even further upon us. So I was having two timelines in that book, and I've been working on this book for more than a decade, but I had an editor and an agent lined up. So when I said, I've got this book proposal that I'm really wanting to write, already had my foot in the door as from a writer's perspective. And he was really shocked because my voice in this book is so different than like my literary voice. But what I said to him is, my goal with writing is to be really accessible, because even when you said the words positive expectancy, I would never say that. I would just say hope.
Ooh,
Like I
yeah,
think
yeah.
that we as clinicians, and especially doctors, like we're so bad at creating jargon and like whole new languages. And it makes this world of healing inaccessible to folks. And
Mhm.
when I was reading a lot of the existing trauma books, there were aspects of many of them that were, very academic and hard to read, and aspects of others that were a little bit triggering. Like they were more intended for the practitioners. And if you read them as a person with lived experience, which many of us are both, it can be really quite activating. And it wasn't considering of those issues. So that was the gap that I noticed when I was reading. And I thought, well, that's something I think I can do, is to create something that, we aimed it at a grade 8 level. I had beta readers, or like practice readers,
Yeah.
that none of them were psychologists or in mental health. They were just people, but they were people with lived experience and who had already done a fair bit of reading on their own. So they had some background knowledge, but they were just representative of my reader. Most of them were women of color. One is trans. Like I just thought, can I create a safe space for everybody? Because white women of wellness, we've been accused a lot of the times of, kind of centering ourselves and trying to speak for others' voices. So I mean, I did my best,
Yeah.
but safety was like the number one goal. So yeah, get some knowledge, gain some skills, absolutely. But safety is the key for
Mm.
me. And I do notice on TikTok, I've mentioned it once, but um, there are some people who show up to TikTok really angry and dysregulated. And I feel that way sometimes. Like the system really harms folks I care about. Like I work in adult addictions and refugee health, and systems are really harming these people all the time. So, yeah, I could show up with a lot of anger, but with mirror neurons, you're going to feel that anger in your body. And that's kind of the opposite of what getting you out of fight, flight, and freeze is going to be like. So, I'm just trying something different, and I don't know how it's going to land, but my gut instinct tells me we need more of this.
I I'll say this. My sister works at the institute with us, and we were like, we need to write a book. And that was about 6 months before we met. And you were talking about your book. And honestly, I was like, oh, thank goodness, because this is so needed. And also, like, now, thank you, because I don't know that I had the capacity to write it, right? Like, this book, it is hard when people ask for resources, because it took me a month to get through The Body Keeps the Score the second time I tried to read it. The first time I listened on audiobook and I had to stop because hearing it was too triggering.
Yeah.
And then the way that I read it the second time was I gave myself a chapter, and then I gave myself 3 days after said chapter. And then I went
Mm,
the next one. And that was how I had to be able to stay in my own window of tolerance around it and let things kind of process through. And again, there's a lot of academic and jargon in a lot of these resources, and they're often written from perspectives that are not necessarily reflective of the humans that are experiencing the trauma. And so there's that piece too of, it's one thing to read a book on trauma that is written about you. It's another thing to read a book on trauma that is written by somebody like you.
mm,
And I'm about halfway through right now. And what I just, even your first chapter, your first two chapters were like, you talked about safety. It felt like, okay, she's creating this space for me to be able to drop in and read this in a way that works for me. And
yeah,
so,
where you wouldn't need to take 3 days off after. It was
right,
funny, I was
exactly.
like, literally a week ago, I was at Bessel van der Kolk's conference in
Uh-huh.
Boston at the Trauma Research Foundation conference, and his book is still flying off the shelves. This
Yeah,
is like what pulled everyone into the conference.
yeah,
Yet, when I got people over, because I was selling my book there and I had
yeah.
kind of a table with both my book and a training program that we're running to create safer workplace environments. And as long as I could get somebody to the table, like 80 to 90% of them would buy the book because I would say, this is the thing I've done is created something that feels gentle and safe, but still tells you the things you need to know about trauma. I mean, from my perspective, and
Yeah.
I'm a family physician, so it's not like I was embedded in trauma for the first, decade of my career. I had to actively train myself in this stuff. I say to some folks, I'm like a wannabe social worker because I love like the clinical social work because you get to be a trauma therapist, but also the social issues around what's causing the trauma and the solutions around the trauma. Like it's not in the individual body. And that's something that I really think physicians aren't always attuned to. We're also not attuned to our own shame and our own creation of medical trauma. And I wanted to show up in a way that I could acknowledge, my complicity in some of these roles as well. And I think some people are quite surprised that I'm able to do that. But like I do the work myself. I've got kind of 2.5 therapists on the go. Like I'm not saying like I'm above doing this work too, but I think the more of us that do it who have this like perceived expertise, and we're not necessarily listening to folks with lived experience. And we also have this kind of professional boundary. And I thought, well, what would it look like, even on TikTok, is to not show up in this really like starched way. And that's not how I show up in real life anyway. But
Yeah.
so I prefer TikTok to Instagram too, because like I'm not the kind of person who's going to do like hair and makeup before I film a video. I'm just going to like hold my phone in front of me. Sometimes I'm in my PJs and that's okay.
Oh, yeah. We're on the same page with that because same. And I think what you're doing is there is that power differential a lot of times when there's a doctor in front of their name, or they have this experience professionally or clinically, academically that I don't. And so I must listen to this person, right? They have the answer. And I think for me, part of showing up also, I'm not going to necessarily, like if I have makeup on, I didn't sleep the night before because it, like that's the only time I usually put it on is if you see me really dressed up, you knew I had a really hard night the night before. If I'm like nothing on and just a t-shirt, like we're great. I'm feeling awesome. But I say that because for the humans who we're connecting with, it's like, no, I just want you to hear my message. This is who I am as a human. And, I'm just reflecting back. I've been out of clinical practice for 2 years now. And when I was in clinical practice, there was this like, I have to show up a certain way. I have to be a certain way with my clients. I can't be vulnerable with them. I have to have a mask on. There has to be distance. And I think you do a really beautiful job of still being in the practice and in the work and also being yourself and being authentic the whole way through. And like, that's a really hard thing to do. Like, that's a really inspiring thing to do, to watch you do.
It's a really hard boundary. Like it's a fine line. Like when we talk about the window of tolerance and trying to stay in that window and, like really good therapy happens on the windowsills. I kind of feel like sometimes I'm not necessarily in the window where I'm going to be bounded enough to keep safe myself because I really do care a lot. Some people are better able to kind of protect their own hearts, but I'm really invested. Like I have told patients that like I've said the words I love you to a patient, and I don't think a lot of physicians have said that. And I'm saying it obviously in a very, very platonic way and non
Yeah.
like romantic way, but sometimes they do really need to hear it. So
Yeah.
what Dr. Gentry talks about is that unconditional positive regard. So many people feel unlovable and they've never had a sense of care from their caregivers, the purported caregivers. And I actually feel that sometimes those of us in caregiving roles, we're the first experience of like actual care and love that they've ever had.
Yeah.
And that is so like such a treasure for me. Like it's such an honor to be that person sometimes. And that's the thing that I wanted to kind of translate. It wasn't just like, I've been a family physician and I can, do things like your mammogram and, listen to your asthma. I can do that stuff too. But what really mattered, especially for the folks that I am more drawn to, because I've always been in health equity spaces, was they often needed love. And
Yeah.
many caregivers aren't willing to do that. And like, to me, it's what gives me life in the job, is to feel like I actually have permission from myself to actively care about folks. And it's not like I'm going to, invite them into my home and give them my cell phone number, although I know physicians who've done that.
Yeah.
I have some boundaries around it, but I think we can be too boundaried. And then we kind of turn off our own humanity. And one of the ways that, as caregivers, I'm sure you've seen this too, is we become kind of cynical and jaded and make jokes. And it's really to kind of cover up our own hurt. Like, we get really hurt in this job that's saying, well, somebody's sick or dying, or somebody's really dysregulated, and you're just going to close that session and open up another session or walk to the next door and put on a blank slate again, without like saying, well, how do I feel about that? Like, what are my emotions? And we don't really give ourselves the time to process. So we just, by nature of the job, become more and more kind of robotic and be like, well, I'm going to compartmentalize or suppress my own actual feelings about what's happening. And I got really good at that. It's something I had to unlearn tremendously, because I was a hospitalist. So we were working 80 hours a week.
Yep.
We ignored all of our own human body needs. Like, it was really intense. And so for me to kind of go into family medicine and then go into trauma therapy, it was like so much permission and invitation. I love how you used that word earlier, to just show up differently.
Yeah. Oh, I was having emotional, like physical flashbacks to my own experience. And yes, it was, there was always this, it felt like riding the edge of, okay, do I get to show this person the compassion, kindness, humanity, vulnerability that I feel like is necessary in this moment? Or do I do what I'm quote unquote supposed to do? Right. And now, the hindsight is always so beautiful. I can say, well, it was a both and at the time it wasn't a both and, it was an either or. And it really did feel like I was having to choose between what the system wanted and what my patients and I needed. And I think honestly, that's what led me to leave clinical practices. I said, I can't continue to sacrifice myself or sacrifice, I made the joke. I was like, I'm either going to get fired or I'm going to like get called in front of the board, not for something wrong, but not for something I think I did wrong, but for something that I think was right, that the system said was wrong. And I was like, let's leave on a good note.
I am so with you. Like, there's a part of me that had so much like fight and flight energy in the jobs that I was, at different times in my career. So I have been an academic physician. I have a master's in medical education, and I ran a residency program in health equity. And over time, the competencies that I knew my students needed, as like, they were already family physicians, they were learning how to work in equity spaces. And I was fighting so much against the postgraduate education office, against the things that I knew needed to be competencies and how we could approach that eventually I thought, well, maybe a fresh pair of eyes can fight this fight, because I feel like I've pushed as hard as I can push. Likewise, in like these other systems, when I was working in community health centers, a lot of times there's this non-for-profit mentality where you're chasing after grants and kind of the tail is wagging the dog. Like, we're going to ditch this program because we can't get the funding for it, but we're going to put all our resources into here. And then a year or 2 years later, when the funding cycle switches, we're going to do this again. And I was like, but these are humans that are being actively harmed. Like, for example, fire all the youth peer support workers and you don't even let them talk to the humans that they were interacting with. Like, that's going to create so much harm in those humans. And like, I just feel like there was harms being done by the system. And it's another reason why the second thing I've studied alongside trauma therapy is systems change. So I've been studying social innovation and design thinking, design processes, because I actually taught those to my patients. We actually ran a social innovation lab. You'll read about this in the book later. We ran a social innovation lab at the community health center. But this is where I think change happens, is when you're not empowering people, you're just amplifying the voice that they've already got. And then how do you use your privilege and your power to help them create the systems change that they know they need? And that was where my interest really lies. So yes, it's one thing to regulate your nervous system and to feel like, okay, I can actually show up. But when you show up, what do you do? And
Mm,
so many people who've been harmed by systems, they feel really passionate about changing those. And so I wanted to say, like, this is part of the process too, because it's the systems that harm us. It's the
yeah.
systems that are ableist. It's the systems that are racist. And unless more of us are able to approach that, especially from the perspective of a person who's been harmed, because they know exactly how that takes place,
Yeah.
they're the ones who can make the change the most effectively, the most compassionately. So I really wanted to give people some skills around that as well. Because to me, that was where I felt at least some hope. Because when you were talking about, is there hope after trauma? Part of that hope is systems change, because
Yeah.
otherwise you just keep getting re-traumatized. And it could be a systems change within a family system or community system, but it could be these bigger ecosystems like healthcare.
Yeah. Oof. I liked what you said too about I don't need to empower them because they already, it's almost like hey, I'm seeing the power in you that's already there. Like
Yeah.
I'm not giving you power. You don't, because you already have it.
Yeah.
It's just a remembrance. And that's so beautiful. And you actually have encouraged me to think about how I use that word in a different way, which I'm really grateful for. And so often, those of us who are in these positions of, well, I'm able to make the changes, is we're like, okay, well, we're seeing this harm. So how do we make the change? And we don't think, well, did we ask the people who were harmed what would help them? And I know that sounds so, you're like, oh, well, they're obviously doing that. They're not. Like, I mean, it does. It seems like a really obvious solution to say, well, okay, the people who this negatively impacted, did we ask them that what would have been more helpful? Did we ask them what would help them moving forward? And when I first went into healthcare, I was excited and naive and walked into that system and was like, oh my gosh, we could change this and we could change this and we could change this. And it was really fascinating looking back. Like, I can watch my light dim and my belief that I could change the system just kind of like peter out of me, to the point that I was like, well, let me just show up and do my job.
I
That
can relate
also,
so much to that.
right? And
Oh, yeah.
but that's also what happens to our patients. And that's what happens to humans over time. Like, that's what systems that are based in inequity and trauma and suffering, really, right? And scarcity, that's what happens. Is over time you go, okay, well, this just is how it is. And we forget that we have the power, or that we have power and we have the capacity to change things. And so I love your reframe around like the word hope, right? Hope is like, maybe I could, even if it's just for me, not even, but like if it's for me, or it's for my neighborhood, or it's for my family, like turning the light back on in that space and going, okay, but maybe I could change this. Maybe this could look different. That's so gorgeous.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have to believe that, like that's kind of what puts one foot in front of the other for me too. I feel like literally on Monday night, my province in Canada, we just voted in an ultra conservative government. And so
Mhm.
we're talking like even beyond Trump, we're talking
Yeah.
more like DeSantis. So like a government that has actively claimed to want to harm already marginalized and vulnerable communities, of which I am a member of
Yeah.
at least one of those. And there's a lot of fear in me around like, oh my gosh, what does this mean for me and to those I care about? But then there's also this like, well, what if I harness this sympathetic energy that's showing up because I'm afraid, and that gives me some of that sympathetic drive? How do I show up and use that energy and actually funnel it somewhere that's purposeful? Because a lot of my colleagues, like a lot of physicians actually are just saying, how can I leave? How can I get out of
Yeah.
here? How can I
Yeah.
get myself safe? And that's the flight part of fight and flight. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, what would it look like to stay here and fight? And I don't know the answer to all of that yet, because I have flighted from some pretty toxic situations before. And I don't know what I'm going to do around this one, but what I'm trying to do is not necessarily be in the sympathetic solely, but like also be the observer to that sympathetic. Because I
Yeah.
think one of the tools that I love to teach folks the most is like, yeah, be where you're at and like feel your feelings and notice and befriend your nervous system, as Deb Dana would say, but also be the observer to that phenomenon.
Yeah.
Be like, wow, how curious am I about the way that my mind body system is responding to that event? And I'm really curious about what possible pathways I could take, because trauma isn't a fixed response. Trauma is something that is it's familiar. And so
Yeah.
you kind of like, oh, I'm a person who goes down to the flight mechanism and I just get out of there as fast as I can. Or I'm a person who just freezes and shuts down, which is kind of like what you were describing, is just like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm just going to put in the time. I'm not going to show up with my full self. I'm just going to be a frozen little robot. We all have those potentials. And what I'm curious about is like, what are the other possible pathways? What are the pathways that are related to connection? What are the pathways that are related to compassion? What are the pathways that are related to my own, getting my needs met? And these are bigger questions that I can only ask from that observer stance. Because when I'm in that sympathetic, all my energy is going into fight
Yes.
or sometimes flight.
I love, the universe is so synchronous, because I was just talking to one of my entrepreneur clients, Katie Max. She's a phenomenal change agent. And we were talking about what would it look like to, instead of try to change the world, what if we worked on embodying the change within ourselves first? And like, what does that mean? And what does that look like? She does a much better job of explaining it than I do. And we were talking about how suffering is different than pain. And suffering often has an element of resistance. And that element is that like sympathetic activation piece. And she said, what does it look like if we're sympathetically activated? Kind of what you're saying, the observer status. Like, what if we drew pleasure and created safety for ourselves around that sympathetic activation? Like, what if we dropped in instead of trying to get out? And I was like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, like that is such a beautiful thing to think about. Like, what if I could feel safe feeling rage and feeling confused and feeling frustrated? Like, what would it look like if I created that safety for myself to have those feelings? And what if then I moved from a place of like not fighting or not running away or not fawning or freezing, but I just stood firm. Like I just stood firm. And I was like, this is what I am standing for. And I will not be moved from this place. You can fight me. You can run away from me. You can try to hurt me. And this is where I am. And that felt so good as she was describing it. I was like, oh, yes. We have a lot of people the same come at the institute sometimes, and they're in fight mode, or they're dysregulated, they're agitated. And I just say, I'm not going to fight you. Your opinion is valid. You're allowed to have your opinion. And this is what I believe. And it's been a really fascinating experience, because I didn't used to do that. I would go into fight mode or I would go into fawn mode. And now it's like, if you want to discuss this, like, I am so here for it. And it's like, I'm not going to fight you. And I'm curious, how is it for you when you have people come into your spaces that are in those modes? How do you handle that? And also I'm really curious. What'd you say?
Yeah, that's my day to day.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't say it's always perfect. So I can tell you what I strive to do, and then probably the reality is not always the case. But what I strive to do is to hold space in that ventral vagal, or that calm and connected mind body state for myself. Not always successfully, but that's certainly my goal. And because I'm a physician and a lot of my undergrad was in neurophysiology, I'm such a geek when it comes to neuroscience. So I love to give them a lot of psychoeducation around what is the process that's happening in your body, and what's the reality around neuroplasticity and learning how to shift things. So much is what I'm sure you do at the Institute. So in the book, what I did was, I think there's more than 40 different skills that are listed. So almost every chapter has some skills in there. So as you were talking, I was thinking, yeah, what are the skills? So there's one skill that I talk a lot about, which is that just knowing that your experiences are perceptions. Like literally
Mhm.
everything is in your head, because your brain is the thing that interprets those signals coming up from your body and interprets your interaction with your environment.
Yeah.
And so, we can gaslight patients into saying, oh, it's all in your head in this kind of derogatory way. But it's actually amazing that it's all in your head, because
Yeah.
you have a lot more ability to rewire what's going on in your head than I would have otherwise known, 10 years ago. So that actually is incredible to really notice it's all in your head. So this experience that you're having is something that is taking place in the nervous system, but that gives you a chance to shift it. So one of the exercises is like, when you're noticing that your heart's pounding, you're kind of sweaty, are you sure that you're anxious? Could you be excited? Like a lot of those sympathetic drivers that happen in our body, they represent different states of being, and it's our perception based on our past experience and the context as to how we interpreted them in the moment. But we can shift that. So you could tell yourself a different story about
Yeah.
what those symptoms are. So
Mhm.
that's one practice that I love sharing with folks. And then a lot of the body-based practices. So as you get into the second half of the book, you'll
Yeah.
see that most of that is very, very solution focused skill sets. So there's a whole chapter on havening, a chapter on tremoring, a chapter on
Oh, I'm so
tapping.
excited.
Yeah. So you can actually learn these skills through the book. Like this
Yeah.
stuff is not rocket science. A lot of it's actually things the body innately knows. And so I
Mhm.
would teach my patients how to do one of those three somatic practices, whatever resonates with them, and say, this is in your toolkit now. So if your anger in the moment is showing up at like an 8 out of 10, and you know that it's the only language you can speak, what if you could dial the anger down to like a 3, and then you could kind of put a leash on it and kind of
Mm.
aim it in a direction that you're wanting it to go? Because when our anger is overwhelming, or when that sympathetic drive is overwhelming, we get kind of in that overwhelm space. And I know that's happened to me lots of times in my life, and this is a skill I'm still working on. But how do we learn how to dial that volume dial down enough that we can feel like it's not driving us, and that we're using it to fuel where we want to go, which is a totally different thing.
What I'm hearing you say is that, and please correct me if I'm missing any part, these practices help bring people back closer to that window of tolerance
Yeah.
so that the curiosity can come back online, and we can use and like find the meaning in like, why is this emotion here? Like, what's going on? And then also, I like to say, that is that the truth? I understand that that's my truth in this moment. Is that the truth? Is it possible that there's other pieces and parts to this that are the truth? And we have 3 kids. That's a skill that we've started teaching to our kids, is like, when you have those overwhelming emotions, let's get ourselves back into that window of tolerance. We're not solving anything. We're not talking this out. We're not doing any of that while that human part of your brain is offline. Right? Like when your conscious thinking is like offline. And what's been really fascinating for me is, our kids just turned 13, and then we have 10-year-old twins, but we've been working on this with them for a couple of years. And actually, I've shared some of these practices with our nieces who are 5 and 8, and they already know how to do this,
Wow.
right? They already know how to do these things. So it's almost like we're reminding them of things that they've known since birth that I feel like society kind of covers up. And so what has been so fascinating is seeing how effective and also how easy it is. And I'm like, why are we not teaching this in kindergarten?
Oh, I know. Don't even get me started. I mean, we started this company, Safer Spaces Training, and our goal is to hit self-regulated professions, but
Yeah.
also like HR of major corporations that understand that like trauma-informed spaces and psychological first aid, like all of that is fundamental to having like
Yeah.
a safe working environment. Like psychological safety is becoming more and more of, a buzzword, as you know.
Yeah.
But it starts young. Just as we know the ACE score matters, like how many adverse childhood experiences you have when you're young, and that kind of exponentially creates these illness experiences, mental, physical, and social experiences as you're older. It's
Yeah.
the same thing with protective factors. If we were able to teach kids emotional regulation and somatic based body skills, like this would change the game. And so, yeah, my goal is to see, and actually one of the presenters at Bessel's conference, she was doing something, I want to say it was called the regulated classroom, and she was doing this work already. And it was funny because she was actually doing a consultation in the province where I am. And I'm like, holy crow, like, people are actually recognizing that this needs to happen. So
Yeah.
yeah, my goal is to get this book into the hands of every teacher and every
Love
parent.
it.
I think these skills are so necessary. And I think we finally have the language and understanding that that's true, because for so many years we kind of had this way of parenting that was very like suppressive, and like the kids are submissive and they
Yeah.
they just kind of follow the rules. And now we're saying, well, who are these little people? Like, let's find out more about what they want and like what their potential looks like. But we're also noticing that part of that thing that they are is struggling with emotional regulation. It's one of the
Yeah.
reasons I joined TikTok, is because young people like Alpha, Gen
Oh,
Z,
yeah.
they are struggling. And the issues that they're facing are quite different than my generation. I'm Gen X, but the solutions are the same. Like, we're all mammals. And that's one of the things that I really loved about a lot of these somatic tools when I learned them,
Yeah.
because I got certified in all of those things. Like Eric Gentry would say, I got certified in the alphabet soup. So I was like, I just want to put the soup out there. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to learn all the things because my thing is KT. I'm going to share everything I learn and give everyone some soup. And your soup might look different. You might add some
Mhm.
spices to it, and your soup might look different. You're going to put some pasta in yours. Great. But I just want to be like, the way people have kind of asked me about how I want to show up. It's like, I don't want to be the next trauma guru.
Yeah.
I want to be a person who is a gardener of my garden, and I'm tending to it as best I can because that's the work. But I also am going to share seeds. So
Yeah.
I'm just a seed sharer, and you're going to take it to another garden or another city or wherever, and you're going to figure out what seeds work in your community. And you might need to modify them. You might have notice some seeds grow easier than others. You might have to nourish them in new ways. But I just want to be a person who gives out seeds. That's kind of the metaphor I've been trying to express with all of this, because
Yeah.
the more of us that do it, the more we'll have these rich, lush gardens that work for our context. Because my context as like a pretty privileged person who's heading towards 50 is really different than some of the folks that I interact with on TikTok. But if I plant a seed somewhere and they're like, oh yeah, I grew something really cool with that, that's where I get excited.
Mm. I am just, I am in a very ventral vagal state. I am so happy over here just listening. And well, I'm going to be honest, I'm going to admit something to you. Part of me was like, oh my gosh, we do very similar work. Can I have her on the podcast? That's the system, right?
Yeah.
The system is you two do similar things, and she's already written a book and you didn't write a book. So like, do you even have her on there? And I caught that, right? And was like, oh no, remember, this is, thank you more, please. Because, right, like people who come to your garden or who are like, oh, I love her seeds, I'd like some of her seeds, right? We may have a lot of humans that like to come to both of our gardens, or maybe somebody likes to come to
Oh,
yours and not mine, or mine and not yours. And I also want to model this for people because I think we have a lot of entrepreneurs who listen to our podcast, and it's this idea of competition instead of going like, how do we help each other? Like, how do we do this as a community? Because honestly, if you told me that I had to go out of business tomorrow because trauma no longer existed, I'd be like, cool, great. I'm going to go back to doing doggy daycare when I was 19 because I loved that job. Like, great. I'm going to be a doggy daycare owner. I'll see y'all later. And I'm over here just going like, oh my gosh, she shared seeds with me. And we can all do that for each other when we take that perspective of, what else can I learn? How can I hear this in a way that maybe I've never heard it before? And that's what your book has really done for me. And I am so excited to share it with our program participants, because we created, these resource guides and all of these things of like trimmer and all of these tools. And I'm like, oh my gosh, but they're like right here and I can just hand them to them. So anyone who is listening to this right now, we'll make sure there's a link to the book and to Dr. Christy's links in the show notes. And if you've tried to go to other resources and you're like, I don't understand half of what they're saying, or wow, I'm having to like go for a walk after hearing 5 minutes of this because it's so activating, this is a different book. And this is something that I think is really going to serve clinicians and non-clinicians alike. And that is like, bravo. I mean, that was a hard thing to do. And I think you did it.
I'm hoping so. I mean, I have 2 more books in the works. Like my plan is to try to continue to learn and continue to share seeds.
Yeah.
But I also think that the work is never done. And one of the strong messages I've been getting is that the work is done in community. So like, it's not the Christy show. It's not the Lee show. Like, and we're not, doing these things in isolation. The more that we're synergistic, the better the work is. And that was a hard lesson for me because like physicians and people with all these letters behind our names, we tend to have some ego-driven processes. So I had to like really take some deep self-reflective dives. I'm actually doing a doctorate right now in transdisciplinary study. And part of it is like a really critical appraisal of my own public works. And there are some shadows. There's a lot of complicity. And the more that I can acknowledge that and be like, oh yeah, that's not how I want to show up, I can try to do better. I mean, it's never going to be perfect, but I'm going to try to do better. And that's the thing that I think the more of us that are having these like ability to be more observing of our own behaviors and our own nervous systems and the way that we show up and how we show up in community, we're also kind of modeling that too. So yeah, I mean, definitely there's a lot of parts of me that get to use internal family systems language. There's parts of me that get kind of activated and be like, oh my gosh, she's like a year ahead of us in terms of what they're up to. And then there's a part of me that's like, how amazing, how great is it that, there's people putting incredible work into the world and you get to add to it. And I think it's that we're taught so much in colonial capitalistic hamster wheel society that it's about scarcity and like you've got to like crawl your way to the top and get your claws out. And it's not that. That's what has created the mess we're in. That's what creates trauma. So I'm trying to figure out how to show up in a different way, but there's a lot of unlearning for all of us.
Yeah. A lot of unlearning. It's not learning, it's unlearning. Just thank you so much for coming on here and rambling conversation with me, like just letting it go where it went. And thank you. Is there any last words that you'd have for listeners or anything else that you'd like to say?
I think I just want to pull on the thread that you really noticed earlier around hope. I think a lot of people who've experienced toxic stress or are suffering because their community is currently placed at risk in these systems that seem to be really more and more oppressive, that there is hope. You can find communities that are safe. You can find ways of showing up that are different. And the more of us that are working towards that, the more we can be synergistic, like 1 + 1 = 10. And I really do believe in that. I've seen it happen. And that's like the seed, like for me, that's like the seed that's a big, tall sunflower, to invoke. I've got Ukrainian guests. And so the sunflower is the flower of Ukraine. And we have to be hopeful that things will work out. There's no other option.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Now I'm looking out the window behind my computer and just like seeing the sun and like thinking of sunflower. I'm like, oh, that's such a perfect analogy. Thank you. Okay. To everybody who listened, go check out the book, go check out the TikTok, do the things. And if people want to reach out to you for more information, we'll make sure that we've got the information in the show notes as well. So if you'd like to connect with Dr. Christy, you can do that as well. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was an amazing conversation, Lee. It was really, really fun. So nice to talk to somebody and attuned and like just vibing in the same direction.
All right, y'all. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Invitation to head to our show notes to check out the offers and connections we mentioned. Or you can just head straight over to institutefortrauma.com and hop in our email list so that you never miss any of the cool things that we're doing over at the Institute. Invitation to be well and to take care of yourself this week, and we'll see you next time.